Hello and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the need to know of getting audited. We're just at 12 o'clock. I want to give people a few more seconds to file in, and then we will get started. Again, thank you for taking the time out of your day. We're just going to take a look at our overview here of the presentation. All right, so before we get started, I do want to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded. As with all Ask a Biller webinars, we will record this and this will be sent out to all registrants, whether they could attend or not. So if you have anyone in your practice that wasn't able to attend but did register, they will receive a recording of the full event here. And we'll have about an hour. So after we introduce our speakers, I'll introduce myself and Barbara, then we will get started with the pre-submitted questions. So these were questions that you submitted with your registration. And then if we have extra time at the end, we will do a live Q&A. And another note, so we're going to be talking about, as you may have gleaned, insurance audits. So we will not be talking about insurance billing as it relates to SimplePractice. Barbara is not employed by SimplePractice, so if you do have questions related to submitting claims or something within your SimplePractice account, then I'm going to direct you to support.simplepractice.com, where you can take a look at our help center of resources. We also have live classes there, and you can get in touch with our customer success team to help you settle everything with your insurance billing in your SimplePractice account. All right, so let's get started. We're going to be talking about everything from audit triggers to documentation. We got a lot of questions, so I'm glad that we have Barbara here to help us out. Barbara is my co-presenter here. She is celebrating 30 years of private practice this year. Barbara is also the author of Navigating the Insurance Maze, an overall insurance guru, and excited to have you here.
Thanks. So delighted to be here. And let me introduce Maggie, who you just heard. Maggie is a staff member there at SimplePractice, and she has been working in the healthcare industry 5 years. She's a great person to be working with. We've had a lot of webinars together. She cares deeply about making health services accessible to more people. So it's fabulous to be here and to be working together again.
Great. Yeah, I think this is our maybe 7th webinar together. So if we move on to our next slide, that brings me to if you are brand new to insurance and you hear some terms being used in this webinar that you might not be familiar with, we have a lot of other webinars dealing with specific topics, including denials, navigating insurance for telehealth. So take a look at simplepractice.com/askabiller series. This is also linked out from the SimplePractice homepage. So you can access all of our previous webinars for free, and great for anyone that's just getting started and you want to learn as much as you can. I highly recommend. The way to unlock those videos is just entering your email, and then you'll have full access. This webinar will also be added there later this week. All right, so let's get into our questions. All right, our first question comes from Tyler, and it is, how is an audit different from a clinical treatment review?
Well, great question, Tyler. A lot of people call me up for consultation and they're like, I've been audited, or I'm going to be audited, and we use that word to mean a whole host of things, and some things it really isn't what an audit is. So we want to really separate it from what is a clinical treatment review. So a clinical treatment review is when the insurance plan that you're working with, or you're working with a client who has that is in insurance, they're wanting to look at the treatment that you're doing, and they're focusing on whether there is a medical need for that treatment, whether or not it's just personal growth oriented, or there's really no diagnosis there, or there's really no need for treatment in their eyes, right? They have a different idea. And they're going to be looking mostly in terms of an approval for ongoing coverage, whether or not and that's usually done by phone. Usually they're going to call you up and say, we want to talk about your treatment for this particular member. Now, audits, what we're going to talk about today, usually involves a records request. and it usually does not involve your treatment. It usually doesn't focus on future coverage. It's usually looking at your documentation or some kind of a payment issue. And we'll talk about very different types of audits today. But I just want to, out of the gate, separate that from a clinical treatment review.
All right, and our next question comes from Blake, which is, what types of audit/records requests are there?
Well, for this one, I had to create a slide for you because there's kind of some main buckets that they fall into. So the first bucket of a kind of an audit, or records request, you can use whichever words you want to use here, is a claim or a payment related audit. Now, and audit, we're just using the kind of like a review. So it could be that it's a prepayment audit. That means that the insurance plan typically, before they pay some certain claims that you've submitted, they may want to ask for more documentation from you. That's called a prepayment audit. So that's before they pay it. They're like, we want to look at some more information from you to see whether we want to pay these claims. Then there's post-payment audits, and these are after they've paid you. They may come back and say, we want to have more documentation to be sure we paid those correctly. And those may be focused around fraud, if they have any reason to believe that there was any fraud, or if they have any reason to question whether or not they might have overpaid you, either because of an error on their side or because of something that they're noticing in terms of a pattern. And we're going to talk about what could trigger audits later. But I just want you to kind of know the overview here. The other type of audits that can happen are what I would call administrative audits. These have nothing to do with money in terms of looking for money back or looking for money in the future, whatever. Administrative audits are basically that. They're just, one type is a documentation audit, where they're coming in and just trying to find out whether the documentation that you have on hand is what you're supposed to have. Do you have everything in your charts that we want you to have in your charts? So this is a quality control documentation. They're just wanting you to have the best charts you're supposed to have. And then we're going to be talking a lot about a risk adjustment audit later. But this is something that's mandated by the Affordable Care Act. And yeah, we'll talk more about that later because that's a whole separate topic.
Yep, we're going to get into a lot of the why. But before we do that, go back to our question from,
there we go. Okay.
from Chaya. And this question is, I've never signed a contract with an insurance plan. My records can't get audited, can they? So this is for all of those providers that are submitting out of network. Can they be audited?
I feel like a drum roll should happen here because some of you are trying to decide whether to breathe or not here. We all get very nervous about audits. And so a lot of people think that because they don't work with insurance directly, you don't have a contract, that you cannot be audited. And it's not true. If you are giving a super bill, invoice, statement, whatever you want to call it, to a client and they are turning it into the insurance plan, it is definitely possible that the insurance plan could ask for documentation of those sessions. It's a long shot. It's not as frequent, but I have talked to therapists all over the country who have experienced different types of review. It's more common like in a prepayment review. So I talked to one provider the other day who she had gotten paid for the sessions, but she gave a super bill to a client and the client turned it into their insurance plan. And the insurance plan denied the payment and wanted more documentation before it was a prepayment review. They denied it until more records were supplied. So it can happen that particularly prepayment reviews might happen for an out-of-network provider.
All right, so even if you're out of network, you can still have a record request. All right, so what are the major issues or triggers that force an audit? And why would I be chosen? And this was one of the most frequently asked questions. So we only have 2 names listed here, but a lot of people want to know what they can do to try to avoid it.
Yeah, and we're going to talk at the end too how to avoid it, but we're right now going to just talk about some of the triggers. So I again created a little slide for that. So we all go, when I'm doing consultations with people, very often they're like, I know exactly why I was picked for this. I've had a complaint from a client, or I've been working with this client that they asked for the documentation for, and it's been a very tough situation, and there's this or that going on. And yet what most therapists don't realize is that it's completely random usually. Usually you've been selected for no apparent reason, and yet we go very concerned thinking it's something particular about this particular client, and that's not usually the case, or something we've done. So the first thing I want to try to depersonalize it. Most of the cases it isn't, and again we have to, depends on what the situation is, but usually it's you are randomly selected. Now it could be a second thing, could be CPT code issues. So what's the CPT code? That's that 5-digit code that you might that you should be using on any insurance claim forms. It tells excuse me, the insurance plan, like what kind of session you had, whether it was a 90834, a 45-minute individual session, 90847, a family session. Let me take a water here. So sometimes it's something in terms of that maybe you used a CPT code more frequently than your colleagues did. This is something that is kind of coming to light with the 90837, the 60-minute individual code, that some of the plans kind of feel that they need to kind of look more closely at people who use that regularly. That's a whole nother topic we could talk about. I use that regularly. It hasn't increased my audit chances, but once in a while I do get a letter from an insurance plan that says, hey, you use this code more frequently than other people, and we just want to make sure you're using it correctly, kind of thing. So they may be looking also at frequency of sessions. It could be if you're doing twice a week, 3 times a week sessions, they're more likely to kind of look at your notes or have a prepayment audit before they want to pay it. They might say, how come you're doing twice a week sessions or 3 times a week sessions? And we want to make sure that that's necessary. It could be the number of sessions for the diagnosis. If you're putting down an adjustment disorder and you're seeing somebody 3 times a week, they might think, well, that's kind of seems incongruous to them. That's not quite what we would expect for an adjustment disorder. Or, something like a more mild diagnosis that so they're going to maybe want to see the documentation of why you feel it's important to meet that frequently, and they'll decide whether they think they're going to pay for it. And a client complaint could trigger it. That's the one we're always sure triggered it, but I want to tell you that's usually not the one that triggered it. But if a client has complained about you, it is possible that they might do some kind of an audit on your documentation and just look at those things. So,
well, we're going to be talking a little bit about documentation later in the webinar, so
yes,
we'll move on to our next question about how often can you expect an audit to be performed?
Yeah, see, we're talking about like 5 different types of audits here, and there isn't, only some of them are kind of annually performed, but you wouldn't be caught in each one. So we'll talk more about a risk adjustment audit later. Those are performed annually. However, if you were audited one year, you're probably not going to be audited the next year and the next year and next year. I've been doing this 30 years. I've been an insurance provider for 30 years. I've actually never gotten a documentation audit. They're very infrequent, for you to be selected out of all the therapists. But risk adjustment is much more frequent. That I've been doing, again, 30 years. That's a new thing, and we'll talk about that. But I've probably gotten about 5 of those. But there's no rhyme or reason to how often you would be audited. It might be very, very infrequently, if at all.
And hopefully the tools that we provide will help you to not live in fear.
Exactly. That is our goal today. Thank you for saying that.
Yes. All right. So Vanessa asks, I got a request for my records. What is the first thing I should do?
Yeah. You mentioned fear, and I want to go back to that just for a minute before I answer this question. sometimes people listen to a webinar like this and they start altering their treatment because they're afraid of an audit. They start altering the things they do clinically. They're afraid of, oh, I'm going to change my diagnosis codes, or I'm going to start meeting less frequently with a client. And I'm just like so not about that. I really encourage you to do what you clinically think is best, and always just support that in your documentation, and try not to just be so fearful of what the insurance will do. If they come in and they question you, usually what's going to happen is they'll say, okay, we going forward, we would think you could meet less. We don't want to pay for 3 times a week. We only want to pay for once. And then you can make a decision at that point going forward. But, try really not to alter your clinical. Okay, that's a little side. What is the first thing you should do if you get a request for records? So here's the first few steps, and then we're going to talk about the following steps later, but don't panic. That's the first thing. We tend to go into anxiety mode and panic. Most records requests are really not as concerning as we make them out to be. The first thing that usually panics us is that there's a deadline on there. Sometimes the deadline is like 5 days away. Like, we need to have these in 5 days. I almost have never heard of a situation where you couldn't call them up and say, I really can't respond in 5 days. I'm going to need an extra 2 weeks or 4 weeks. Every time I've heard of it, they've granted it. So don't panic about the deadline. They give you a deadline just to motivate you to do something about it and to scare you, but who cares? They can give you all the deadlines you want, but there's really tends to be, depending on the records request, no deadline consequences if you don't meet the deadline, let's put it that way. But definitely call them up and ask for them to push back the deadline. Now, the first thing you should do is try to read the records request carefully. And I should say the first thing you might get is a phone call asking to verify your your fax number or your address. So you might not first thing get something in the mail, but you might. So read it carefully. Don't go crazy. Wait for them to actually send you this thing in writing, and then read it really carefully. And I say really carefully because you're going to look for 2 words, and you're going to look for risk adjustment. That's going to put it in a whole different category. And these are sometimes very buried, those words. So if you see the words Affordable Care Act, that's going to tell you that it's probably risk adjustment. And if it says risk adjustment, you can breathe a lot because it's a much less worrisome type of records requests. And again, we'll be talking about that. Then contact the requesting agency and ask them, don't do anything till you contact them and say, what is the purpose of this? What is the minimum I can release? What's very interesting is that a lot of the releases you're getting are saying, we want your progress notes, we want your informed consent, we want your this, we want your that, we want your diagnostic treatment, we want your lab tests. It's the same release they give to doctors. We want your cancer screening, like all kinds of things, like what? So when you call them up and you say, what is the minimum I can release? Depending on the type of what they are looking for, they might say to you, just a treatment summary is fine. And then that's much less stressful, right, than giving your whole notes. And then if they say that's fine, what needs to go in the treatment summary? And just make it the minimum, just the minimum. What else do we talk about here? Consult your professional association. They are handling calls from therapists all over the country about records requests, and they probably can help you, especially if they have legal advisors. Contact me. I can walk you through it, and I can help you read exactly what they're looking for and how to respond to it. And remember, don't release your psychotherapy notes if you keep them. Let me be clear what a psychotherapy notes are. Psychotherapy notes, and people get confused with progress notes and psychotherapy notes. They aren't the same thing. Progress notes are those notes that you should be keeping as the client's medical record, where you put start and stop times, you put progress, you put problems that they're talking about, symptoms, what interventions you did, you know, la di and da, all of these things that happened in the session or the issues you're working on and the treatments you're providing. Psychotherapy notes by HIPAA says are ones that if you keep them, you need to keep them separate from the client chart. And these are your theoretical musings about the case. These are kept usually by more psychodynamic clients, therapists, excuse me, who might be looking at countertransference and wanting to make notes about that, or about transference, about any kind of separate, and those are afforded a higher level of confidentiality, but they need to be kept separate. So most of us don't keep psychotherapy notes, but if you do, don't ever release those except with a subpoena. Now, the other point I want to make that I didn't put on the slide is don't ever rewrite your records in response to a request. That is fraud. If you are trying to make it look like you had records when you didn't have records, or you didn't have good records, rewriting them and then kind of backdating it would be fraud.
And two notes on this.
Which we have a whole webinar on fraud, which you can check out on the SimplePractice page.
Yep, that was exactly what I was going to say. The last time we had a webinar, we talked all about how to avoid fraud. So you can check that out. And then we'll also give you Barbara's contact information at the end of this webinar to contact her in the event that that happens, or you have questions once you have a request. All right, so our next question is, I got a call from insert name of requesting agency. It may be Inovalon, Cotivity, Episource. I don't know how to pronounce the other ones.
CioxHealth.
Yes, saying that they were requesting records. Why did I get this? I'm freaking out. Who are these people? This is a lot of questions that we had.
Yeah, and a lot of people are like, I don't know if these are real agencies. I don't want to just release this all. So I just actually got a call from Inovalon this week. So that's my 5th time getting a call from Inovalon. These are all different agencies that do risk adjustment audits. So we're going to talk about risk adjustment audits because they're probably the most common kind of records release that you would get out there. And this can, again, happen to you if you're in network or out of network. It's much more common that it's in network. If you're out of network and you get one of these, I'd call them up and see if it was an error. But sometimes there are certain situations where an out-of-network provider would get one. But okay, what is this all about? I'm going to spend a little time because this is such a little confusing, but it's so common that I want you to understand. This is not something to freak out about. This is the Affordable Care Act, which went into effect about 2013. Changed things drastically in terms of it made insurance company take on people regardless of their health situation, and they could no longer charge more for taking unhealthy people onto their ranks and their roles. So basically, this little agreement was made that insurance plans who operate on within the Affordable Care Act, they would have this way called risk adjustment, that they could figure out which plans had the sickest individuals and which plans had the more healthy individuals. So what the plans are doing, these plans that we're talking about here, these are independent companies that are hired by the health plans, and they're going to be looking into our notes, or they're wanting to look into our notes for diagnoses that are not on our claim forms. So I interviewed Inovalon a long time ago, and Anthem also, and I said, why can't you just go by the diagnoses that are on our claim? Well, I didn't finish explaining that. Okay, so why are they looking for diagnoses in there? Well, they basically, if they can see that that my clients have sicker, they have a higher risk adjustment score because in there's more diagnoses than I have on my claim form, they're going to get a higher score. And then at the end of the year, they're getting a snapshot of how sick their members are. And then they basically compare with the other health plans that are on the Affordable Care Act marketplace and the one plans who have the sickest people get to get money back from a fund. So this is a thing that has nothing to do with your treatment. It has nothing to do with your clients. It has nothing to do with the quality of your notes. It has no consequences for you or your clients. It doesn't matter whether they're paying their premiums or anything like that. Bottom line is the health plan is trying to get a kind of a snapshot of the health of its members. And the way they're doing that is they're looking in our notes to see what kind of information they could get about their health. Now, I interviewed Inovalon, as I mentioned, and I said, why can't you just go based on what we have on our claim forms? Can't you see we have, 100 people who have major depressive disorders? We have this many people who have anxiety disorders, and can't you just go based on that to see how ill your members are? And they said, well, there's going to be things in your notes that might not be on your diagnosis. So like if a client had, at the age of 14, had bulimia, and they got treated for that, then they're no longer currently bulimic, that client would get a higher score because they might be in the future cost us more money to treat them, or they had a higher likelihood of a higher bills for us. So basically they're trying to forecast future expenses, and they're trying to recoup from these other plans. I'm sorry if that's very confusing, and I hope people understood that, and if not, ask questions. Definitely we'll try to get to that. But the point is, it's a very administrative thing, and it has nothing to do with you or the client that they're asking for the notes for. So it's one that we should not freak out about. It's the least threatening of all the type of notes requests that we could get, in my opinion.
Yep. So they're out there looking. It's not you. I think that's fascinating to me.
And you can have really crappy notes, and they don't care. They
Right.
are basically like think of a computer just going through your notes looking for diagnosis information. If you have bad notes, you have bad notes, but they're still looking for words. They're looking for diagnoses. They're looking for symptoms.
Right. They are fishing for that specific type of information.
Yeah.
All right. So then the next question, naturally, is can I refuse to release my notes for a risk adjustment audit?
Yeah, there's a lot of kinds of audits that we talk about that you can't refuse to release your notes for, I would say. This one's a more interesting one. When this first started happening in 2013, we all just released our notes. I mean, that was just the thing we did because we thought we had to. Over the years and talking to legal representatives, they have really altered their advice, and I've altered my advice. And when I talk to the attorneys at the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, they're saying, if you want to push back and you want to say no to this, you do have that option in ways. No, the health plan will tell you, no, this is part of what you signed on for, and the client has already given you a release, to the health plan that they will go through any kind of administrative, audit. But this is one that a lot of therapists decided that we're going to push back on because, it's not benefiting our client. It's not something that we see the purpose of, and some of us feel, like myself, that they need to find some other way to do their risk adjustment without asking for, patient charts to go flying all over the place, to these third parties. So what are your options for responding to risk adjustment audits? You could just release the chart without talking to your client. You are allowed by HIPAA to release the chart, and the health plan could say, yes, that's part of what the client agreed to when they, participated, when they initially signed up with the insurance. You could talk to the client, and if the client says, no, I don't want you to release, you could tell the requesting agency, I'm not comfortable releasing without a client release. Excuse me, did I say that right? Without a client release. You could check your state laws, and what the California Association of Marriage Family Therapists was saying, and go by state law. State law is actually says you need a client release to release a to a third or any client chart, you could just say to them, hey, I'm not comfortable because of state law. Now they could say to you, and in the letter it says to you, you don't need a client release because HIPAA doesn't require one. But what the attorney said to me is, well, when state law is more stringent than a federal law like HIPAA, you have to go by state law. Now, again, you're perfectly going to be within your rights to do either one. To release it, you're going to be covered. But if you want to fall back on state law, check your state law, and you could probably just quote to them that I'm not comfortable without a client release, so please go get my client release. Even though you know you're seeing the client tomorrow, nobody said you had to go get a client release. Let them get it. That's just one way I have of thinking of it. If they want this, then get my client's release. Another option would, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I'll let you finish. There was, before we move on to the next slide though, I just want to clarify one thing.
Okay. Now your other option is just don't talk to the client and just tell the requesting agency that you'll comply once they get the client release. And again, you can be very nice about it and say, hey, I'm always happy to comply when it's the client's chart. We have to keep remembering it's not my chart, it's the client's chart. And if you would feel better having the client's release. About number two, the first time I got this something from Inovalon, I just talked to my clients. They asked for 2 charts, and I talked to both of them, and they both said, yeah, I got that. I explained the purpose of it, and they both said, go ahead and release it. I got nothing to hide, which I was kind of surprised about. And so I released it. Again, if I've informed the client, you know, what it's about in the most objective way possible, and they say that's fine, and I have a release signed by them, then again, you're fine there. So you have all these options. What I would tell you not to do is, oh, the other thing I didn't put on here, which we kind of discussed earlier, is call up these places, ask them what's the minimum that you can release. 99% of the time, they will tell you you don't need to release the progress notes, even though that's what it says on the request. What I'm hearing over and over and over is that they're saying, well, a treatment summary would be fine. And here, just cover these things like date of service and prognosis and problems and diagnoses or something like that. Something, and don't write 20 pages. Give them like 3 sentences each and send it to them. If you're going to do that, you know, that's a middle ground option too. But that takes time to put together a treatment summary. I don't really want to do it. So it's really up to you what you come up with. But I'm just saying you have lots of options. Don't feel like you have to send the charts. And what we're seeing, even this week, somebody called up. What tends to happen is if you call Inovalon back and say, for example, I'm just using them, and say, I'm not comfortable releasing this without a release for my client. They document it. What they typically are saying to people is, okay, I'll document that. And then they move on. You never hear from them again. So what we're finding, and I have, you know, is that I've talked to people all over the country for the last 7 years about this, and I have never heard from anyone that they had a negative consequence for not complying with a risk adjustment audit. Now, I'm very specific about that. With a risk adjustment audit, if it's some other kind of audit, you can have negative consequences. But this is one that I've never heard anyone kicked off a health plan. I've never heard anyone who suddenly got a regular kind of financial audit of some sort. And I even asked the California Association of Marriage Family Therapists, I said, you've got 34,000 members. Has anyone ever told you that they have received any kind of negative consequences for standing up to this? And they said no. So, you know, that this is a work in progress. I will say that one person told me that she got one from United Healthcare from another company. Which one was it? And they were a little more pushy when she tried to stand up. So it could be depending on, you know, who's the requesting agency, but they said that they were going to get a client release and come back to her. So we'll see if they do.
And the one thing I wanted to note, which Barbara mentioned at the top of this question, but we received another question, which was if a client finds out they have a higher score, and it comes from our notes, will that jeopardize their future insurance opportunities? And just to clarify that as long as the Affordable Care Act has been enacted, your clients cannot be denied insurance for, and their price adjustments cannot be changed based off of diagnosis and based off of illness. So they're not allowed to be denied for pre-existing conditions, and they're not allowed
I want to be even clearer. You will have no idea. It's not a person. There's no score coming back to me, and there's no score I'm going to document. I have no idea what score they came up with, and I don't think that they actually even keep the score with the person. Maybe they do, but so I'm not going to have any feedback from me turning in these notes. I will get no response. So you won't be in the situation of having to document a risk adjustment score. And I don't think, again, it's oh, this person is going to cost us more type of thing. They are just trying to compile data so they can say, we have 8,000 members and we have this many people who are ill, so give us money. You know, it's not about individual people and that there can be any bad consequences for the client. That's what I was trying to stress before. Yeah.
Great. So let's move on to our next question, which is, I got a request for a documentation audit. Can I refuse this? What can I expect? And another note, what happens if you just ignore it?
Good, all good questions. So a documentation audit, if you think about it, it makes sense. It's any time that the health plan is saying, we want to check and check your documentation. We want to check what is in your client charts. Do you have the necessary coordination of care releases? Have you documented on each page the client's name and have you got a progress note for every date of service that you filed a claim for? And what's in those progress notes? Is everything in there? Do you have information about the client's emergency contact information or the medications that they're on, or allergies even? So there's a whole list of things that they will go through it and look for. But again, they're just looking at what are you doing and is it up to snuff? Is it up to what is expected from you? So can you refuse this? Pretty much no. This is part of your, and I don't think you should, but let's say this from you're participating with a health plan, because this only goes out to people who are in a health plan. One of the things you agreed to when you signed up with a health plan is that they get to check out your documentation, and they are required to do this for their credentialing agencies, right? They have to randomly pick some people who are on their plan, some providers on their plan, and make sure that the documentation is good. That seems fine to me. I have no problem releasing my records for that reason, because I feel like that is, you know, if I'm working with a health plan, they have the right to make sure that the quality of my records is standard of practice. So I would say, no, you can't refuse this if you're in network. What can you expect? Basically, they're going to want to come in and, like I said, not just see your notes, excuse me, not come in. They're going to want to see some sample charts. It could just be one chart or a couple charts. And they'll want to see those other things. What we talked about, treatment plans, is going to be something that they're going to want to see. All those things I just mentioned. They're going to look at all the things. They have a documentation audit tool. So stay tuned, and I'm going to tell you more about that. And they're going to go down the list and see, and then they're going to score you. And usually you need to get a score of like 70%, and then you pass, something like that. So a lot of people pass, but a lot of people do fail. Now, what if you fail? What these are all about are quality improvement. It's not about punishment, and your name will not be in the paper or the spider pages or anything like that, like, bad therapist. You could just realize that they're going to say, hey, you didn't pass this time. Here are the ones that are missing. Here are the ones that are not really up to what we expect. And usually it's about teaching. They're going to tell you, this is what we want you to start doing differently. And then what they might do is in 3 months or something, ask you to submit a record again and see if you've corrected it. So I think of these as like a fix-it ticket. They kind of are telling you, hey, you got a broken tail light. We're not going to take you to jail. Go fix the taillight and come back and show us that you fixed it. So if you think of a documentation audit in that way, that it doesn't have to be so scary. That's what I'm hoping that you will feel if you get one of these. What else did I want to say? Yeah, you're given the opportunity to improve. So that's the thing. Most of us, I'm not even sure if I would pass a documentation audit. I should probably not say that, but you know, there's parts of the record I do really well, and there's parts I probably don't do that well. So that's fine. If they're going to tell me that I need to be better at my treatment plans, or that, you know, I don't have the person's whatever on every page, that's something that I can definitely improve, and I'm open to that.
Yeah, you're never perfect, so you're never done, I guess, even after you are in practice for 30
Yeah.
years. So.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at our next question, which is, what type of information will insurance companies request when auditing a client's medical record? And is there a standard checklist we can refer to?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you a nice link to that. Here, let me put you forward to that. So what I did is, instead of creating slides with everything that they're going to be asking for, which is what I know you guys really want to know. You want to know, okay, give me the darn checklist so I can do it for my own records. I actually have the ability, I am giving you guys, for showing up today or for listening to this afterwards, a treatment plan audit tool that they actually used in one insurance plan, which is Magellan. And this is one that is very standard. I've looked at other treatment plan review tools, and you could just, if you go to my website, which is theinsurancemaze.com, write that down right now, /contact. And all you have to do is mention SimplePractice audits. Make sure you say audits, because we've been doing a lot of SimplePractice talks. Again, it's theinsurancemaze.com /contact. Mention SimplePractice audits, and I will send you this treatment record review tool, and you can go through your records and you'll be totally set to know, you know, where are your weaknesses, where are your strengths, how would you do on a documentation review right now. And like I said, this is Magellan, and it doesn't matter if you're on Magellan. It's a very standard type of tool. They ask often the same kind of information. You know, Medi-Cal or Medicaid and Medicare are going to have a slightly different, but these are some really good things. If you have these, you're probably going to. But you can, the other thing I want to say is, any plan that you're on, you can write and get their documentation audit tool. You can find them usually on the internet in their provider handbook or something separate. So you could ask your health plans that you work with, but like for their audit review tool or treatment record review tool. The things that they're looking the most for in certain situations that I wanted to mention is documentation to support your billing. So that's something I want you to be thinking as you're documenting. So that's why it's so essential that you guys write start and stop times for sessions. Now we'll take a minute here and just talk about that's actual start and stop times, not what time it was scheduled to start. So that's 1:02 to 1:54 p.m. Then the next week, maybe it's 1:03 to 1:56 p.m. If they see that kind of documentation, they're going to, first of all, match it up with the billing that you did that day. Oh, was it actually 53 minutes and above? That means you can use the 90837. Or was the client 10 minutes late, but you still billed for a 90837? Then they're going to, so they're going to be matching up, not just looking at your progress notes, but they're going to match it up to your claim forms that you've submitted. CPT codes, you know, they're going to be looking for that, and modifier use. They want you to back up your modifier use. How do you do that? If you're using the modifier for telehealth, for example, you should be documenting the client's, was it a video session? That should be in your progress note. Video session, client at home, or client at 123 Main Street in San Francisco. So we are actually required to even document the location where our client's at, so we could send help if we need to. or if to make sure that you're not practicing across state lines, if that's possibly a problem. So make sure that you're doing that telehealth documentation too. That's another thing that they'll be looking for. And the other thing I wanted to mention here is treatment plans. They are really looking at treatment plans and making sure that you have them and that you have documented that you've reviewed it with a client. That's one of the things that they check off. You'll see on this review tool that you actually have some documentation that the client reviewed it with you and that it's signed and dated. So there's things like that that you just wanted to kind of maybe start getting some new habits. All right, so make sure you got that, theinsurancemaze.com.
Yes, and that's a great tool if you're just getting started with insurance, or even if you've been doing it for years, but just to have something on hand that you can refer to.
Right.
All right. And our next question is, if my records are requested, might they ask for money back? And might I have to refund payments if the insurance company is not satisfied with my clinical note? And there were a lot of questions about having to send money back and what that process is like. So we can talk about that.
Yeah, we're really concerned about that. That is a major fear. And I don't want to, dismiss it, but I have to say again, in 30 years, I've only had to send back money on maybe 4 occasions. And those were situations where I was actually paid in error or overpaid in error. So that I definitely needed to pay that back. There was no question in my mind. So certainly if there's like an overpayment or a fraud or something like that, that's usually when they're going to, it's not usually about they're not satisfied with your clinical notes. They're not going to, but sometimes. And here's a couple repayment request triggers that so unless it's a claims audit, usually they're not looking for money back. But what are the biggest things you should avoid? The most likely reasons why they might ask for money back is if they come in for an audit and there's no documentation for a session or insufficient documentation for a session. Now, again, in a documentation audit, that's probably not going to make them pay. It's not about money in that. If they're actually looking to pay claims that you've submitted and they say, hey, send us the documentation for those dates of service, and you have absolutely no documentation to support that you actually conducted a session on that day, or it's really insufficient, you don't have like dates or times or anything, they might say, we're not going to pay those claims, or we paid them and we shouldn't have. But that, again, that's very infrequent. But yes, it could happen if you have no backup for the things that you are, the sessions. Again, we talked about lack of actual start and stop times. I have seen this in rare occasions where they have come in and said, you're billing for a 60-minute session, but we have no proof in your records that you actually committed, that you actually started and stopped, and it was a 60-minute session. If every time you put 1 to 155, 1 to 155, 1 to 155, they don't believe you. So watch out for that one. Incorrect coding. They might ask you for a repayment if you actually put down the wrong codes, or if they thought that you were purposefully putting down the wrong code so that you could increase your reimbursement. Lack of documented medical necessity. So that's possible. These are all really long shots. No notes submitted in response to a request. So yes, we talked about earlier, can you ignore them? If they say we're not going to pay this claim until we get notes, and you don't submit any notes, yeah, then they might, or they might ask for money back, or they might refuse to pay. No documentation of telehealth consent. I put a question mark here because somebody told me this. I don't want to spread rumors, but one therapist told me that she was turned down payment or had to pay money back because they said she had no documentation of a telehealth consent. This is something where our best practices and maybe legally required is that you either have a physical telehealth consent in your records, or that you document for each session verbal consent to do the session by telehealth. So I totally require you to have a physical telehealth consent signed by your clients I have one in my practice forms packet, which is available on my website on the store page. And lack of a treatment plan. Again, this is something that one therapist over the years told me that she got asked money back because of a lack of a treatment plan. Now, for that one, she worked in a like a hospital setting or a clinic, so I'm not sure if they just have kind of higher standards that they actually would ask for money back, but they usually don't go after us little private practice folks for money back. They're usually going after people in a bigger setting where they can get more money back, like hospital settings or large agencies. So.
And in my experience as a medical biller, I find that more often than not, it's their mistake that they're going back and correcting. So they paid for a plan that they weren't the primary for, and now they need to get their money back, or they paid on a client that they didn't realize was coverage lapse. So be mindful of that.
That's a good point. Yeah, sometimes you're paid and then they come back later and say, oops, we shouldn't have paid because there's another insurance plan that's primary. We're actually only secondary. And I have had to pay back for that and then go after the primary to try to get payment. What a mess that is. Ugh, it's my bane of
we also have a webinar on secondary claim filing. So
yes, you do.
If you are curious about that, that's also on our recorded page there. All right, so our next question is, what can I do now to get my notes in a better place in case they are ever requested for an audit?
So the first thing is obviously get that sample document checklist that I'm giving out for free. So come to my website on the contact page and just ask for the sample document checklist and do your own self audit, right? Contact your plans you work with and get their audit checklist, or just go to their provider manuals, which are online. I know you've never read them, but go down to what's required in their documentation and they will have a list. Or better yet, you can join me. I have a pre-recorded webinar on what should be in your progress notes, what should be in your client charts. I have a pre-recorded one and I have a live one coming up in a couple weeks, January 30th on Saturday, and would love to have you there. And we're going to do a deep dive, a 2.5-hour webinar on, hey, what should be in those charts so that you please insurance plans and you please ethics people and legal people and disability people and everything, so you don't have to sweat. We don't want you to sweat when you get any kind of request for records, which are happening more often. You guys have to all maybe be noticing that, when I first started out, nobody requested records. Now it's a thing. It's happening. We all need to be prepared for it.
And I think that's a great note to wrap up our pre-selected questions on. I want to remind everyone of some webinars that we have coming up. So we have 2 clinical focused webinars where we have a panel of experts in their respective fields. We'll be talking about a collaborative look at cancer care in January, and then we have an interdisciplinary look at stroke rehab in February, and then Barbara and I will be back in March to talk about joining insurance networks, which is a great topic for anyone that is just getting started or thinking about getting started working with insurance as an in-network provider. I know I got a ton of questions about where do I begin? I'm brand new to private practice. So this one is for you. This one's for everyone who's still on the fence about whether or not they should go in network. And then we have a little bit of time for some open Q&A. So I have some lined up here. Our first one came from Jandy, which is how much time do you usually have to respond to a claims request?
To a claims request?
To a
records request?
I would assume that means a records request, yeah, or an audit request.
Yeah, like I said, they often will say the letter will sometimes be dated like a month ago, and then you get it and it's like respond in 5 days from the date that you received this, and it's just something that's totally ridiculous. Like I said, don't even pay attention to the deadline. I can't think of any ones that I would totally sweat the deadline. Just call them up. Especially during COVID, we can just say, oh, I'm not at my office. It's going to take me a while to get records, if you want to. I'm not advocating lying, but I think they're certainly being much more flexible about deadlines, but they were flexible before. The only ones they documentation might be a little bit more like they really want to get going on that, or if it's a claims payment one, you want to get it going because you want to get paid. If it's a prepayment review, so I don't have an exact date of how. Yeah.
I think it depends on how much you want to put it off.
Yeah.
As my mom always tells me, thinking about it is worse than doing it. So.
Yeah, and I always tell people, put them off and then schedule a consultation, and we'll prepare you for whatever type it is. We'll read it over. You can fax it to me. We can see what type it is, and then we can help you walk through the steps.
All right, so another question came from Caroline, which is, would the insurance do an audit after a client is closed? And is it less likely if the client is closed?
Closed, like in that person's gone from your.
Yes, like you're no longer, you've closed their record.
They don't care about that.
They don't know.
Well, they're not going to do a clinical treatment review, like we said, because they're no longer trying to determine whether they want to keep paying for sessions, right? But they could certainly go back and do a financial post-payment, if they've already paid, review of something, or they can at any time do a documentation review or a risk adjustment audit, anytime.
And then this person asked, I received a letter from UHC for a client who presumably submitted a super bill, so she's out of network. Do I need a release from the client to respond?
I would say so. If it's completely, I would call them up again and just say, I've received this release from you. What is this for? I'm out of network. And they may say, oops, you got it by accident, and go away. So I wouldn't even bother contacting the client until I'm sure that, because it may be their error. It often is. But yeah, then I would get a client release because you have no permission at this point, and because you have, to release anything to anybody, as an out-of-network person.
And Becky asks, how far back do insurance companies typically audit for dates of service? For
these risk adjustment ones, they're able to go back only 1 year. However, prepayment and I don't know, I would say you're usually talking about a year. However, I've gotten some interesting ones where they certainly are looking back farther than that sometimes. So I would say 1 or 2 years even.
And Rachel asks, you said don't go back and change records when audited. However, is it too late to clean up prior records now if I haven't been audited yet?
Yeah, see, we use this term clean up records because that makes it sound good. But basically, there's no way to clean up a record, really. Anything that you do now that makes it look like if I have records that are just like illegible, I can't just go back and make them neat and make it look like I wrote them neatly at that time. That is still that's still fraud, because I'm rewriting, I'm rechanging, and trying to put an old date on it. I can't do that. What you can do, I think the number one thing you do is just start having better habits. Your records need to be legible. That's one of the most important things that they're going to be looking for to anybody who would pick them up now. They need to be able to read them. They need to be able to understand every word in it. So don't use a lot of abbreviations. So start good habits now. Don't go back and try to clean up your records at this point. The only thing you can do to clean up a record that's legal, pretty much, is if you want to add addendums, you can do that, but you have to date it today's date. You can say, oh, I want to add this treatment plan, but you have to date it today. You can't go back and make it seem like you had that at the beginning of treatment or something like that. Or I want to add this information, which I didn't put in. You can do that, but it has to be with today's date on it.
All right, and we'll take one more question, and that is, will insurance be okay with the Wiley treatment planner? And are there any treatment plans that are insufficient for the insurance?
So I don't use the Wiley treatment planner, though it has some really good parts of it. You have to be able, whatever treatment planning software or books that you use, you have to be able to still pick out medically necessary treatment goals. And some of those treatment planning goals that are in Wiley are, improve self-esteem. That's not one that an insurance plan would probably cover as a main goal. So you still have to be able to pick out, reduce anxiety, reduce depression. That's something that insurance plans will support. You have to understand medically necessary, that whole criteria, which is about, hey, insurance plans only cover things that are not about personal growth. They don't cover having a better sex life with your husband. They don't cover, a feeling, understanding the meaning of life or your career. So you have to really be sure that you're picking goals. Wiley can be great, but just make sure you're picking goals and objectives that are, first of all, personal to your client. You have to not make them cookie cutter. And the second thing is make sure that they are medically necessary goals.
All right, so we're just at time. To wrap things up, we have a few more reminders here. The first is to make sure that you visit Barbara's website, sign up for her mailing list, and you can email Barbara any questions that you have. Also want to remind you, not any questions, any questions related to SimplePractice, direct to SimplePractice, any questions related to auditing, direct to Barbara. And then a reminder that this webinar will be recorded. So if you missed the beginning or if you have some colleagues.
Want to listen to it again and again.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want to revisit anything, you will receive a recording of the webinar after we close out today. And then if you are new to SimplePractice, or if you haven't tried SimplePractice yet, you can try a free 30-day trial, no credit card required, anytime. And if you have colleagues that could benefit from using SimplePractice or just getting started in private practice, you are able to earn $50 for every referral that you submit. All right, and thank you everyone for spending some time with us here today. And hope we ease your fear a little bit of audits. And thank you, Barbara, so much.
Delighted, and thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day.